Hello, I'm Tom Putnam, the Edward W. Kane, Executive Director of the Concord Museum. And on behalf of all of my colleagues, I welcome you to this special Memorial Day program, and we thank you very much for watching. In response to the COVID-19 crisis, the museum has created a new History at Home series. And as Memorial Day approached, it occurred to us to craft this special edition. For me, Memorial Day generally involves being in the Seacoast village where I grew up. There's a small parade and a lovely ceremony. We listen to the high school band, remarks from a decorated veteran, the playing of taps, the laying of wreaths, a 21-gun salute. But this year, when we need to feel a sense of community and belonging more than ever, there will be no parade, no gathering with our neighbors. I was struck recently by the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson after he graduated from Harvard College and the intellectual stimulation and the sense of community that he felt there. He was living alone in what he described as, quote, a solitude of unshared energies. Each of us, I'm sure, has experienced our own unique sense of solitude over these past weeks and months, not being able to connect with family, with friends and colleagues the way we're used to. So we hope that this special Memorial Day program can connect us as a community, even if we are watching it from the safety of our homes. The program begins with a brief tour of Ralph Waldo Emerson's house across the street from the Concord Museum. For this year, Memorial Day happens to fall on Emerson's actual birthday. We'll then return to the Concord Museum, where I pay tribute to the late Peter Brook, who passed away peacefully and of natural causes on April 1st. We miss Peter dearly and the opportunity to mourn his loss with his family and his friends. Following that, our focus switches to the Melvin Memorial and Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. As you may know, the tradition of Memorial Day stems from the nation needing to mourn the loss of the soldiers who died to protect and preserve our Union, including 3 brothers from Concord, the Melvin brothers, for whom the memorial is dedicated. I'll speak with biographer Harold Holzer, who's written a biography on Daniel Chester French, who himself grew up in Concord, and is the artist who sculpted Mourning Victory, the sculpture that's at the center of the memorial. We'll then hear from Erica Loam, our curatorial associate, who will show a maquette or a model of the sculpture that's on loan to the Concord Museum from Chesterwood. That's Daniel Chester French's home in the Berkshires where he had his studio. Erica and our curator, David Wood, will then give you a tour of the memorial itself in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. The last portion of the program are taped remarks that David gave at the rededication of the memorial on a rainy Sunday afternoon last June, the 110th anniversary of the original dedication, with members of the Melvin family in attendance. David's remarks are particularly moving, and I hope that you will watch them thoroughly. Following David's remarks, Neil Rasmussen recited a lovely poem that was written by a former soldier who fought alongside of the Melvin brothers. And then fittingly, we will end with the laying of wreaths, the playing of taps, and a 21-gun salute. In this time of national mourning, we hope that this program will provide solace, perseverance, and strength to all who watch it. May it help us break through the solitude that we are all feeling and give us a sense of shared energy to face the future together. Thank you. So we're here, David, outside of Emerson's home. Can you just say a word or two about when he moved in and the years that he was here?
Sure. This is, the family calls this house Bush, and it was built by a member of the Coolidge family in 1829, and Emerson and his second wife, Lydian, moved in here as soon as they married, and then Emerson, that's in the 1830s, Emerson spent the rest of his life at this house.
And, the life, the house is filled kind of with his life, but I wanted you to comment, since this is Memorial Day, on he also encountered death many times. It was a part of his own life. Comment on that.
He did, and Emerson's take on that takes up a lot of his intellectual life. Actually, it's not a denial of death, but it's a refusal to be overcome by mourning. And I can't say that he actually accomplished that, but it was a goal, almost a stoic goal, to not be affected by what happens in the world. Emerson wrote a good deal about it, but the death of his son was just staggering.
Talk a little bit more about that. His son Waldo. How old was he when he died?
He was 5, and of course, a bright child, and Emerson just dearly loved the little fella. So it was very painful for him.
And I was reading in a biography recently the loss of Margaret Fuller, who was a close friend, also affected him quite deeply.
It did, and again, Margaret Fuller's loss was an intellectual loss for Emerson. He was nearly frantic. He sent Thoreau down on a mission to find any of her papers that he possibly could. She was bringing back a history of the 1848 revolution in Italy, and it was lost. That was at least what Emerson writes about more frequently when referring to that loss.
And his friendship was based on that intellectual companionship.
Oh, absolutely. She was an intimate of the family, and spent many months in this house.
Okay, well, let's go inside. So, David, first we're in the study. Do you want to comment, just make a general comment about Emerson's study? And
sure. Well, it was the center of his life. This was his working place, and he shared the space with a great many people, his family and his visitors, but it was also the intellectual center of Concord in the 1840s and 50s, which makes it the intellectual center of the United States.
Hello, I'm Tom Putnam, director of the Concord Museum, and I'm here in Brooke Hall, which is named after Anne and Peter Brooke, to pay tribute to Peter, who passed away peacefully on April 1st of natural causes. The first time I met Peter was in this space. I had only been in the job for a couple of months, and we invited him over to see the renovations we were doing to this area, especially to Brooke Hall. And he had a real twinkle in his eye as he remembered the many days that he and Anne spent here and the fundraising they had done to help build this building, as well as his work and their work together at Mass Audubon and with the Boston Symphony. My, what good times those were, he recollected. The last time I saw Peter was also in this room. We were reopening this space after we had renovated our galleries last October, and he was here with his friend Joan Eddy. And I joked, I looked up at this clock, which is a Joseph Mulliken clock that Peter's firm had given to him on his 65th birthday. And I joked that I thought it was perhaps taunting a new piece of equipment and technology that we were opening and showing on display for the first time, taunting it as if, whether 220 years later, the new piece of technology would be working as well as that clock still does, overlooking Brooke Hall. I remember joking that the clock was looking down on us, and Peter happened to be in the balcony as well, and he smiled. And he was looking down on us that evening, as I know he and his wife Anne are smiling kindly upon us and the work that we are doing now here at the museum. The historian David McCullough once suggested that a digital watch is the perfect symbol of the imbalance in outlook in our day, because a digital clock only shows you the very moment you are living in, that instance, as if that's all we need to know, is that all anyone would wish to know. Joseph Mulliken's clock, on the other hand, with its 2 hands and old-fashioned space, shows what time it is now, what time it used to be, and what time it will become. I'm confident we'll get through this current crisis to a brighter future, both for the museum and for our planet. But the journey will not be nearly as joyful without Peter Brooke at our side.
So we thank you, Peter, for your contributions to the museum and to our world, which is a much better place for your having lived in it. Hello, I'm speaking today with Lincoln Scholar and prize-winning author Harold Holzer, who I've just learned has another prize associated with his name, the 2020 New England Society Award for Best Art and Photography Book on New England for his biography, Monument Man, The Life and Art of Daniel Chester French. For this special Memorial Day program, Harold and I will be discussing French's masterpiece, Mourning Victory, which is part of the Melvin Memorial at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. So thank you, Harold, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Dan French worked on this sculpture from 1906 to 1908. To provide a context for us, where does that place his work in his larger oeuvre? And what pieces, for example, preceded this commission and which ones were still to come?
Well, he had just been working on a major commission for New York City, the continents, to adorn the new Customs House in Lower Manhattan. And there they still stand at the foot of Wall Street overlooking New York Harbor at what was once the most important center for tax revenues in the United States. That was before the income tax became a bigger income generator than customs. So it was a big deal. And from the Concord Commission for Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, he moved directly to his first major portrayal of Abraham Lincoln for Lincoln, Nebraska.
Interesting. In another portion of this program, my colleagues will tell the story about the Melvin brothers who passed away in the Civil War, but perhaps you can recount the surviving brother and why he chose Daniel Chester French to do the sculpture.
So the surviving member, James Melvin, had known Dan French from their Concord days together. So they met right after the Civil War in about 1867, I think. And they stayed in touch, and James Melvin became quite successful and wealthy. And when he decided it was time to memorialize the brothers who died in the Civil War, there was no question but that he would turn to his old pal Dan, and Dan just loved the idea, so he accepted the commission immediately.
And whereabouts did French work? I know he had studios in different locations. Where did he work on this piece?
Well, he worked for the most part. Now, he did take his work back and forth. He worked summers at Chesterwood in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And then in winters, he worked in his New York City studio. So he would transport work back and forth by railroad car, which sounds a little frightening, but he did it. We do know that he did most of his work on Mourning Victory in Stockbridge. And interestingly, it was probably the first work he did at a brand new studio. He had built a studio adjacent to his gorgeous summer home, designed by Henry Bacon, who will come into this story too. And that's where he worked on his early commissions in the late 19th century into the early 20th century. But the workplace became so busy and so public with customers, some tourists, workmen, assistants, modelers, clogging up the works there, not to mention his family and his daughter's friends, that he had another studio built down the hill, across the main road, and on a slope opposite his house. It was just called the Other Studio in those days, but we know it today as the Meadowlark. It's actually a rentable hotel facility rented by the Red Lion Inn. And this place had 3 railroad tracks that led out from the interior of the studio out onto a hill. So French could see his works there outdoors, as many of them would appear, which gave him the advantage to see them in natural light. But also it had enough of a slope so that he could walk down the hill, and for works that were going to be on pedestals, unlike Mourning Victory, he could look up and see exactly the perspective they would have and he would require to sculpt them. So this was a piece in the new. Now, it's also said that he enjoyed sculpting his live models in private more than he liked doing that in a studio that was crowded. I'm not sure that he ever misbehaved. In fact, one of his models said to him later, at that very studio, "Mr. French, I've written my memoir." And he said, "Really?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "Good thing you always behave." So I guess he was very professional.
You've introduced Henry Bacon. Tell us the role that he played in the Melvin Memorial.
So by this time, Bacon was his go-to guy for backgrounds and benches and slabs and all of the accoutrements that would welcome the major sculptures. So for the Melvin Memorial, he provided the bench that is sort of a refuge, the slabs that honor the three brothers who died in the war, and some beautiful decorative pieces that have sort of martial imagery, rifles that refer to the corps that the three boys had served in. So Bacon was always his prime designer. As I said, he designed his home. He would design this almost as this piece was being dedicated in 1909. He designed the slab that backed the standing Lincoln for Lincoln, Nebraska. And then we all know that a few years later, Bacon got the commission to design the building of the Lincoln Memorial, and in turn hired Daniel Chester French to do the sculpture, sort of a reversal on their longtime relationship.
Maybe you can talk for a moment about the sculpture itself. Again, it's called Mourning, Victory, Mourning, as in one who mourns a lost loved one. What was French trying to evoke with the sculpture?
He was trying to evoke reverence for the spirit of sacrifice, I think. You know, French did not express his artistic intentions in writing. When interviewers, and you know, by this time he was with St. Gaudens, the most famous sculptor in America, and St. Gaudens died, leaving French alone at the pinnacle of this craft. But when people asked him, "What did you mean by that?" He would say, "It's all in the art." And he did not like to talk about what he was trying to convey. But his daughter attested to the fact that although he had been the artist for a number of equestrian portraits of generals, and would continue along that line a little bit, that he had begun to feel the pain of war and the cost of war in a different kind of way. And he meant this to the Melvin Memorial to reflect a nation's sense of perhaps triumph and reunification, because the main figure is called Victory. But she does carry an American flag, but the flag is carried over her head almost as a shroud. So there is a sense of a sacrifice almost as much as glory.
And how was the piece received, and what did French himself think of the work?
It was received rapturously. It got rave reviews from newspapers and artistic publications. And French not only said that he thought it was the most successful assignment he had done to that date in his career, but he authored an article. I know I just said he didn't like to comment on his art, but he did comment on other people's art, for better or for worse. So he did a magazine piece a few years later on the 6 greatest war memorials, meaning Civil War, in the United States. And guess what work he ranked first? Mourning, Victory. So I think he had a pretty high opinion of it. And who could not feel that way when you see it in its setting? I mean, the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is such a spectacular and evocative setting, and to see this statue rising like a ghost in the middle of the beautiful grounds is an incomparable experience, I think.
Yeah, and we will show it as part of this program to our viewers. But there is another sculpture, another version of it. Tell us where that is, and the institution that you have long connections to.
I know it. Mr. Melvin thought the work was so successful as well that he financed 3/4, I think, a copy of it in marble of the central piece, the figure of victory for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it holds pride of place today near some other French works. Another memorial piece for Martin Milmore, for example, in the Engelhard Court, which is the big American sculpture court at the Met, which one day will be open for visitors again, we know, we hope. And it was carved by the same marble carver who had done the first piece, a family of artisans known as the Piccirilli brothers, from Italy, of course, but they worked in the Bronx, right near what would become Yankee Stadium. For those who know that area, you can situate their gigantic studio, which was occupied almost a full city block. And French would, of course, be in control of the work, and he would go up, sent the model there, and then went up there himself and supervised and polished and made changes along the way. But it was said that Dan loved to go to the Bronx because every day at noon, one of the Piccirilli brothers had been tasked with making pasta for lunch. So that was supposedly a great diversion. And the brothers worked in tandem. They allegedly would hand over a chisel when one needed a break to the next brother, and they would seamlessly continue the work that the preceding brother had left off. It's interesting, the French model for the work and the Metropolitan copy are the same, in that the figure of Victory holds her right hand out with a laurel wreath, whereas the version that was carved for Sleepy Hollow Cemetery uses the left hand for the laurel. I hope I've got the hands right. I know it's the opposite. I'm not great at that. And there's an interesting story behind it, that Henry Bacon and French visited the site, as they always did before they commenced work. And Bacon commented that because of the sun and the shadows, that if the figure held the sprig of laurel in her right hand, it would cast an unnecessary and prolonged shadow over her face. French might have thought that the shadow feature was exactly what he had intended, but he listened to Bacon, and so they did a mirror image of the concept for Sleepy Hollow, and then reverted to the original for the natural overhead light of the Engelhard Court at the Met.
Well, thank you. I alluded to it, but Harold Holzer was a senior vice president for public affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in addition to being a Lincoln Scholar, and we spoke with him today because of his biography, Monument Man, The Life and Art of Daniel Chester French. Harold, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Hi, I'm Erica Loam. I'm the Curatorial Associate at the Concord Museum, and today I'm here to talk about Mourning Victory, Daniel Chester French's sculpture commemorating the Civil War dead. James Melvin, who was a Concord resident, commissioned this sculpture from Daniel Chester French in 1906, and it was to commemorate three of his brothers, Samuel, John, and Asa Melvin, who had joined Company K of the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery and had perished in the Civil War. Nearly 45 years after that event, he commissioned his childhood friend, Daniel Chester French, to make this sculpture. French crafted it between 1906 and 1909, and today it stands in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. What you're looking at today is a maquette, a plaster scale model of the sculpture which he finished. And this was made between 1906 and 1907, and it demonstrates what would become the full-size model of the sculpture that you see in the cemetery. Mourning Victory reveals Daniel Chester French at the peak of his artistic powers. Trained in France and Italy, he was an exemplar of the Beaux-Arts sculpture tradition, which really encapsulated allegorical themes, naturalism of form, attention to anatomy, and all of those features you can see in this plaster model. Now, Daniel Chester French was not a carver, he was a modeler, so he would create the image in clay and have it made up in plaster, and then would send the design to carvers in New York and elsewhere. So we can really see French's hand in this maquette. And what you're seeing here is the figure of Victory, an allegorical figure. And she is emerging in a relief sculpture from under a shroud, which is the American flag, and in her right hand she's holding a laurel. And this is meant to be not necessarily a glorification of battle, but really a pondering of sacrifice. And she is downcast, her eyes are closed, and she's looking down at those who died in the Civil War. And it's a study in contrasts, which is really a beautiful thing. If you take a good look, you can see darkness and light. You can see the deep cavity that she's emerging from, and also the protruding figure emerging to the surface, and also the movement of her hair and of her arms, but also the stillness of her gaze. And this really is one of French's best works, and really pays tribute to those who died in the Civil War, and is among one of the great examples of memorial sculpture that really peaked between 1880 and 1920. And it was completed and dedicated in Sleepy Hollow in 1909. And next, my colleague David Wood and I will be giving you a tour of the sculpture at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Well, we go from the maquette to the final product, this monument which was dedicated here on June 16th, 1909, the anniversary of Asa Melvin's death. What can you tell me about the changes made to the final product?
Right. Well, the most apparent one is that he flipped it. You look at the maquette, and it's her left arm that's raised and bent. But when French came to this site while he was working on this, he looked at where the roads were, how people would be coming in, looked at where the sun was, realized that if it were her other arm, it would shadow her in a way that he didn't want. This figure's emerging from inside the stone, and he had to really balance the light to get what he wanted. So he just thought nothing of completely flipping it. But then when he did the other version of it for the Met, he went back to his original conformation, the one that you see in the maquette.
What can you tell me about the surroundings?
Here, well, Sleepy Hollow was one of those garden cemeteries established in the late 1840s or in the 1850s. Emerson dedicated it. But prior to that, this was a favorite haunt of Emerson and his friends, and the children used to play here, used to play baseball here. Thoreau talks about playing baseball up here, and Hawthorne used to walk in Sleepy Hollow.
When you consider what surrounds the sculpture, I mean, it really stands out. Not only is it the most impressive memorial in the cemetery, but what do you think its legacy was outside of Concord?
Well, it was immediately pretty well received, and it still is. I mean, it's still held up as the most effective, or one of the most effective American memorial sculptures. It's a particular idiom in its own right, but French kind of summed it up really toward the end of that tradition of memorial sculpture. And it's where he began, of course, as just a 21-year-old, got the commission for the Minuteman at the North Bridge and stuck with it.
It was recently rededicated?
It was conserved over a couple of decades, all told. But when it was finally finished, it was rededicated last year.
Wow, what was the ceremony like?
Wet. It rained, but it was very nice, solemn, with descendants, a number of descendants present, and it was quite something.
For those who can't see, the inscription underneath the sculpture reads, "In memory of 3 brothers born in Concord, who as private soldiers gave their lives in the war to save the country. This memorial is placed here by their surviving brother, himself a private soldier in the same war. I, with uncovered head, salute the sacred dead who went and who return not.
We now turn to the keynote address for today's ceremony. Our speaker is Mr. David Wood, curator of the Concord Museum, a position he has held since 1985, for 34 years. There are few who are as deep-dyed in the history of the town of Concord, Massachusetts, as David Wood. He has written and spoken on the lives and works of great American authors, buried only a few yards from this spot, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau on Author's Ridge. And he has also taught and written about Concord citizens less well known than these famous authors. His interests extend to Concord's involvement in the American Civil War. In 2011, he created an exhibition for the Concord Museum entitled When Duty Whispers, Concord in the Civil War. It is in this capacity, as a scholar and student of Concord's involvement in that great war, that he is with us today as our keynote speaker. He will address us on the history and significance of the Melvin Memorial. Please welcome Mr. David Wood.
John, the first of the Melvin family to live in Concord, was here by 1700. What might be termed a Melvin family tradition of volunteer military service began with John's son David and continued through the 18th and 19th centuries. Amos Melvin is given credit for ringing the alarm bell in Concord in the pre-dawn hours of April 19, 1775. So it is perhaps not surprising that John and Samuel Melvin left their jobs in the textile mills of Lawrence to enlist for 3 years in the 14th Regiment of Infantry in response to President Lincoln's call for troops in the spring of 1861. The 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery joined the 14th Regiment, and together they became the 1st Regiment of Heavy Artillery, Massachusetts Volunteers. Their older brother Asa enlisted in the same company as John and Samuel, Company K, a year later, and near the end of the war, the youngest of the 4 Melvin brothers, 17-year-old James, joined the 6th Massachusetts Volunteers. Of the 4 Melvin brothers, only one survived his service during the Civil War. James in 1909 wrote, "At the close of the war, I was a poor lad of 17 with no assets except what nature had given me. At that time, I made a vow that I would sometime erect a fitting memorial to my 3 brothers. For more than 40 years, this has been in my mind, and it is nearly 30 years since Mr. French, one of the friends of my youth, was consulted. 5 years ago, he accepted my commission. The result is the beautiful and inspiring monument which you today have dedicated. I am certain you will all agree with me that the youthful hand that fashioned the Minuteman and in mature years created the Millmore Memorial has lost nothing of its cunning. May it forever stand a memorial to these 3 brave soldiers, and what is of vastly greater importance, an inspiration to future generations to follow the path of duty, though it may lead, as it did with these brothers, to that greatest sacrifice that can be made by man." James was 19 when 17-year-old women remained friends. This memorial, which occupies a privileged place at the very pinnacle of American public sculpture, derived from that friendship. But there's another memorial to John, Asa, and Samuel, a literary one, Samuel Melvin's diary. In 1863, Samuel Melvin got a new diary, received a very nice diary from Dow, the best one I have ever seen. Dow was John Dow, a sergeant in Company K. Samuel made an entry of 80 or 90 words nearly every day, recording details of life on garrison duty. Washington was surrounded by nearly 70 forts armed with enormous siege and field cannon that fired 24 and 30-pound projectiles, and manning the guns was the responsibility of the heavy artillery regiments. None of the forts was ever taken, and few were even attacked, so garrison duty could be fairly quiet. Samuel kept busy. He had an aptitude for electrical engineering and applied it to making some money on the side by gold-plating chains, belt buckles, and other items. Got some things for electroplating, and if I could get enough work, I could make money like smoke. Set my battery up and gave the sergeant a shock. A few days later, he wrote, "Plated a chain for John Welsh and put on a good plate. Not every project was an immediate success. Worked all day trying to plate a pistol for the sutler. Got all discouraged." Samuel was vexed with the pistol for several more days before he eventually succeeded in plating it, probably in nickel. Samuel's success was no accident. He studied electricity, metallurgy, science, he wrote in one entry, and he solved the problem of the pistol by corresponding with a man who supplied him with batteries and gold solution. Samuel studied more than metallurgy. Went to city with Dow, had a good time, bought Pope's work, $1.25, and he got a book on mythology. Pope is English poet Alexander Pope, whose translations of Homer made the Odyssey and the Iliad accessible to those without any Greek. Got Milton's Paradise, he recorded on another occasion. Samuel apparently built up quite a library. Inspection by Major Rolfe, that's Samuel's commanding officer, Frank A. Rolfe. He took a great shine to my library. Told Shatswell I was a well-versed fellow. Despite the Pope and the Milton, Samuel's real interest lay in science. Studied surveying with hills. Like it first rate, he noted, which suggests he had some trigonometry. But his real interest was physics, which Samuel referred to by its alternative name, natural philosophy. Studied natural philosophy as usual, he wrote one day, and the next day, studied philosophy. The day after that, he wrote, read the encyclopedia, learned some new facts about philosophy, which I was glad to learn. 10 days later, he received Silliman's philosophy. It is first rate. I am much pleased with it. Silliman is Benjamin Silliman, Jr., and the book is First Principles of Physics, or Natural Philosophy, designed for the use of schools and colleges. Within a week, Samuel wrote to Professor Benjamin Silliman, Yale College, New Haven, Connecticut. I like that kind of correspondence better than the silly newspaper gush. Although garrison duty did not entail combat, it was still dangerous due to the unsanitary conditions. Samuel's entry on October 9, 1863 reads in part, Brother John went to the hospital sick with the dysentery, which is the same disease that killed Abraham Lincoln's son Willie and nearly killed Louisa May Alcott during her nursing stint in Washington. He was very sick, the entry goes on. Asa was present. Doctor gave him opium, did no good, told me he could not live until noon. I was with him all the time. He failed very fast from the middle of the afternoon and died very easy at last at 11 o'clock at night. Samuel began 1864 with a resolution. Next year I shall be very punctilious and note everything in my new diary, which was a Christmas present from Dow. It is a good idea, and I cannot express the joy it afforded me in looking over John's diary when he had passed to the Summerland. Perhaps in some future day, after I shall have passed to the spirit life, someone may take as much pleasure in looking over this. Who can tell? Samuel's grief at John's death was in time eclipsed by his eager anticipation of the end of his enlistment. Great excitement over re-enlistment, he had written in November, adding, I did not. He had signed up in June of 1860 for 3-year service, and by February he was fairly counting the days. Put on citizen's clothes to see how I would look. I wish I was a citizen and could wear the clothes, he wrote at the beginning of the month. And on the last day, today is the last of the old winter, and one more muster will muster me where we wish to be, in civilian life. Samuel had plans for his civilian life. The studies he undertook were not just to relieve boredom. He had, in November, received a letter from Dow offering me a college education, and this may be why he corresponded with Professor Silliman at Yale. He was also planning a trip to England. The first entry in his new diary reads, Where will I be next New Year's Day? With Dow in London, I hope. In March, Company K was ordered to Fort Tillinghast, another of the garrison forts around Washington. Got up in the morning and washed in a mud puddle, Samuel wrote, adding, "Don't think much of this fort or anything around it." The move was associated with the conversion of the artillery companies around Washington into infantry, which was part of General Grant's strategy for replacing troops lost in combat, as well as the many troops like Samuel Melvin, whose 3-year enlistments were about to end. "Had an infantry drill in the afternoon," Samuel wrote on April 8th, "the first I have drilled in 6 months. I did not see as I was any greener than the rest of them." The next day he mused, "Today is my birthday, 20 years today. When I am 20 more, I will be quite old, will I not?" 3 weeks later he wrote, "Orders came for us to draw our camp and garrison equipage. This looks like moving, sure." Eventually the move came. Orders for us to move. We are going now into rough usage, I guess, but let it come. But if we go, I should like to return. This would be Samuel's first experience of combat. "Heard firing, and it looks like hot work," he wrote on May 17th. "This is a rough life, and one that I do not like, but I shall stand it like a man." Samuel was in the midst of what would come to be called the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, 2 weeks of fighting that saw little gain for either side but heavy casualties for both. "Struck our tents about noon," Samuel wrote on May 19th. "Marched on quick time down a hill, then countermarched, lay on a hill, then went down and our battalion went after the Rebs. The fire was awful. I was taking another soldier to the rear. I had to leave him, and I saw the Rebs behind me. I surrendered. They did not fire after. I got a horse to ride, and the provost guard took me. I could not wish to be better treated. I slept rough, but was truly thankful for my treatment." Samuel was captured in Virginia and spent the next 2 weeks traveling the 700 miles to Andersonville Prison in Georgia. May 20th. "Rather small rations, but the Rebs give as good as they can. I will be glad when this cruel war is over, but it must be fought to the bitter end. We are treated with our captors." May 21st. "No rations all day. Marched all day, started early, did not rest nor have anything to eat. It was indeed truly painful." May 22nd. "The guards were everlastingly kind to me." May 23rd. "I shall be glad when we get to our journey's end, where we can get something to eat." May 24th. "Got some rations. I ate quite hearty for a prisoner, and I felt like a new man altogether. I never knew what it was to be hungry before. I was so weak I could hardly stand. Oh, how good a good meal would taste, such as I could get at home, but I must not dote on such things now." Almost immediately, Samuel began to express a desire for being exchanged that was as strong as his earlier wish for the end of his enlistment. The hope for a release from prison never left him. May 25th. "This is surely mighty dull. I sleep all day. Don't I wish I could stop in some of our New England farmhouses and get a cup of milk? But never mind. I'm looking forward with strong anticipations for our time of exchange. Then it will be like a new heaven for me and my comrades." Andersonville was a dreadful place. In an area about twice the size of Emerson Field, up to 30,000 Union prisoners were held. 13,000 of them died. June 4th. "It is sad to see them carry the dead by into the dead house, a continual train of them all. How I hope that I shall live through it and be permitted to enjoy the true fruition of my life, which I have put so much confidence in and placed such bright anticipations upon." For the next 3 months, Samuel's diary records in woeful detail life, such as it is, in Andersonville. He was sick nearly the whole time, and while there are occasional expressions of sorrow, Samuel knew better than to give in to self-pity. "A fellow in Company G died at 8 this evening through mere discouragement. think I shall stand it, but it is rough indeed. It seems especially cruel that a new group of prisoners should have brought Samuel the news of Asa's death. July 10th. Today, sad news indeed, I must record. I learned by one of the prisoners brought in that Brother Asa was shot through the heart while charging the breastworks at Petersburg, June 16th, 1864. A faithful natural philosopher to the very end, Samuel recorded a great deal of suffering, along with kind thoughts of his friends in K Company, thoughts of his brother James and sister Caroline, memories of the place where he first saw light, and a desire to see the little starry flag again. I will conclude with the last line from Samuel Melvin's diary. September 15th. As things look now, I stand a good chance to lay my bones in old Georgia. But I'd hate to as bad as one can, for I want to go home.
Thank you, Mr. Wood, for those words. When this memorial was originally dedicated in 1909, there were still veterans of the Civil War living and able to attend. Many members of the same 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery Regiment, to which all three of the brothers memorialized here belonged, attended that ceremony. One veteran of the regiment who was on hand had written a poem to honor these three fallen comrades. This soldier poet, Mr. William Sharrock, from Lawrence, Massachusetts, was wounded with so many others of his regiment on June 18, 1864, in one of the many fights in front of Petersburg, Virginia. Sharrock later lost the use of his arms. He wrote this poem honoring his fallen comrades by holding a pen between his teeth. He titled his poem, "Move Softly." On the day of the dedication of this memorial, another of their comrades from the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery was present to read William Sharrock's poem. The date was June 16th, 1909. Today the poem will be read again aloud by Mr. Neil Rasmussen on the same site where it was first read 110 years ago on this very date. Mr. Neil Rasmussen is president of Save Our Heritage, a local group dedicated to the preservation for the whole nation of the historical, cultural, and environmental resources of the Massachusetts towns of Concord, Bedford, Lincoln, and Lexington. Please welcome Mr. Neil Rasmussen, who will now read William Sharrock's poem, "Move Softly."
Hush, move softly where you tread. It is hallowed by our noble dead. The clash of battle now is o'er. They now await the eternal shore. Nay, not eternal, they rest a while. The reveille will form the file. They'll answer to the captain's call, and here they'll answer one and all. The captain watched the glorious fight. Yes, guided he both day and night. Permit he could not sin to sway, and destined it must pass away. Reign on forever peace and truth. Contend for this, ye men and youth, that when the final roll shall call, you'll answer here, one and all. Hush, move softly where you tread. They sleep within their narrow bed, and now await the trumpet's sound to pace upon celestial ground. The bugle sounds at captain's will. Be fervent all, be still, be still. The reveille will soon be called. They'll answer, here, one and all. Hush, move softly where you tread. It is hallowed by the noble dead. Not dead, resurgent to rise again, to join with angels' sweet refrain. They but await the bugle's sound, to pace upon celestial ground, that when the reveille shall sound its call, they'll answer, "Here," one and all.
And now we will hear the sounding of taps with echo, and the laying of wreaths will take place.